The woman sitting across from me had tears running down her cheeks when she whispered, "Please pretend to be my husband for one dinner." I thought she was joking until she placed a wedding ring in my palm and added, "My mother has been waiting 12 years to meet you." Then, when we walked into her mother's house and the older woman looked at me, she covered her mouth and said, "I knew she'd find you." Before we begin, if you believe in kindness, forgiveness, and second chances, please like this video, leave a comment, share it with someone you care about, and subscribe for more heartfelt stories. Your support helps us bring more inspiring stories to life. My name is Caleb Mercer, and until that afternoon, I had always believed the hardest part of being alone was coming home to an empty apartment. I was 34, worked as a civil engineer in Cleveland, Ohio, and had become very good at pretending I was perfectly content with my quiet life. I had friends, a decent job, a small apartment filled with books I rarely had time to read, and a kitchen where I cooked for one almost every evening. What I didn't have was anyone waiting for me. Years earlier, I had loved someone deeply, but that relationship ended so painfully that I stopped believing love was something people could keep. I told myself I had simply grown up. The truth was that I had grown afraid. Then I met Nora Bellamy. It happened at a neighborhood bookstore on a Saturday afternoon when I accidentally knocked a stack of gardening books onto her shoes. She laughed instead of getting angry, and while we picked them up together, she told me she had been looking for a particular book about restoring old gardens. I found it on the bottom shelf, handed it to her, and she smiled as though I had performed some heroic act. We began talking. 10 minutes became an hour. An hour became coffee. Coffee became a friendship that neither of us planned but both of us quietly needed. Nora was 32 and worked as a physical therapist at a rehabilitation center. She had an unusual ability to make people feel safe. She remembered small things, like how I took my coffee or which stories made me laugh. She also carried a sadness I couldn't explain. Sometimes, while we were talking, her expression would change for just a second, as if a memory had opened a door inside her that she desperately wanted to close. For nearly 8 months, we were friends. Not almost lovers. Not secret lovers. Just friends. At least, that's what I told myself. Then one Tuesday afternoon, she showed up at my office. She stood outside the glass doors wearing a pale blue blouse, holding her purse with both hands. Her eyes were red, and she looked frightened. When I walked toward her, she immediately said, "I need to ask you for something terrible." I tried to make her smile. "How terrible?" She didn't smile back. "I need you to be my husband." I stared at her. She swallowed hard and explained that her mother, Evelyn Bellamy, had been recovering from a serious heart procedure. Evelyn had one request before she traveled to stay with Nora's aunt for several months: she wanted to have dinner with Nora and her husband. The problem was that Nora wasn't married. "She knows that," Nora whispered. "But she thinks I am." I couldn't understand. Nora had apparently told her mother months earlier that she had finally met someone and was getting married. She had invented a man because Evelyn had become obsessed with the idea that Nora was lonely and would never allow anyone close enough to love her. Nora said she had intended to confess the truth, but her mother's health deteriorated, and the lie became harder to undo. "Why me?" I asked. Her eyes filled again. "Because you're the only man I trust." That sentence should have made me happy. Instead, it frightened me. I agreed. The plan was simple. We would have dinner at her mother's house that afternoon. We would pretend we had been married for several months. After dinner, Nora would tell Evelyn the truth. But when we arrived, everything changed. Evelyn Bellamy was sitting beside a sunny dining room window when we entered. She was a thin woman with silver hair and tired blue eyes. She slowly stood, holding the back of the chair for support. Nora took my arm. "Mom," she said softly, "this is Caleb." Evelyn looked at me. She didn't look confused. She looked devastated. Her fingers tightened around the chair. Then she whispered the words that froze my blood. I knew she'd find you. Nora immediately stepped forward. Mom, what are you talking about? Evelyn didn't answer. She kept staring at me as if she were looking through the man standing in front of her and seeing someone else entirely. Then she said my full name. Caleb James Mercer. My stomach dropped. I had never told Nora my middle name. I turned toward her. How does your mother know that? Nora looked just as shocked as I was. Evelyn slowly sat down and pressed a trembling hand against her chest. Because your father used to call you that. My mouth went dry. My father had died when I was 17. And I hadn't spoken about him with Nora. Not once. Evelyn pointed toward an old wooden cabinet near the hallway. Open the bottom drawer. I didn't move. Please, she said. Nora looked at me. Caleb, what is happening? I walked to the cabinet and opened the drawer. Inside was an old photograph. The moment I saw it, my knees nearly gave way. There were 3 people standing beside a lake. A younger Evelyn. A man I recognized immediately. My father. And between them was a little girl with 2 crooked braids. Nora. I turned around slowly. Nora was staring at the photograph, tears beginning to fall. My mother knows your father, she whispered. Evelyn closed her eyes. He didn't just know him, she said. Your father was the reason my daughter survived. What followed felt like discovering an entire missing chapter of my own childhood. Years earlier, when Nora was 19, she had been driving home from college during a snowstorm when another vehicle lost control and struck her car. Nora survived but suffered severe injuries. Her father had died several years before, and Evelyn was working 2 jobs while trying to keep their family together. They couldn't afford the rehabilitation Nora needed. My father, Daniel Mercer, had been the supervisor at the construction company responsible for repairing the highway where the accident happened. When he learned what had happened, he quietly paid several of Nora's medical bills through a charitable fund. But there was something Evelyn hadn't known at the time. My father had discovered that the driver who caused the accident had been one of his own employees, a man who had ignored safety procedures. Daniel could have protected the company and avoided a lawsuit, but instead he admitted the truth. The company lost a major contract. My father lost his position. And our family lost nearly everything. I remembered that year. I remembered my mother crying at the kitchen table. I remembered my father telling me that doing the right thing sometimes meant accepting that you might be the person who pays for it. What I didn't know was that Daniel had helped Nora's family too. Evelyn reached for my hand. Your father saved my daughter's life, she said. And then he disappeared from our lives. I looked at Nora. She was crying silently. Why didn't you tell me? I asked. She shook her head. I didn't know who you were. Then she explained the secret that made everything even more painful. After the accident, Nora had spent months in rehabilitation. During that time, she became friends with a young volunteer who visited patients and brought books. His name was Caleb. My name. But it wasn't me. It was my father's nephew, Caleb Mercer Jr., who had volunteered at the facility under his middle name. Nora had believed for years that the young man who helped her rediscover hope was someone named Caleb Mercer. She had never seen a photograph. Years later, when she met me at the bookstore, something about my voice, my smile, and the way I listened felt strangely familiar. She hadn't consciously recognized me. Her heart had. That was why she trusted me. That was why she had asked me to pretend to be her husband. But there was still one question neither of us could answer. Why had Evelyn said, "I knew she'd find you"? Evelyn wiped her eyes and finally told us. After Daniel lost his job, he visited Evelyn one final time. He told her he was ashamed that he couldn't continue helping. Before he left, he gave her a letter. He asked her to give it to Nora when she was old enough to understand. But Evelyn never did. She had been angry. She believed Daniel had abandoned them after helping them once. She didn't know he had been fighting his own battles, trying to rebuild his life and protect his family. Then, years later, after Daniel died, Evelyn discovered the truth. She found documents proving that Daniel had sold his car and emptied part of his retirement account to cover Nora's medical treatment. He hadn't abandoned them. He had sacrificed everything he had. And Evelyn had spent years hating a man who had quietly loved her daughter like family. She looked at me with tears streaming down her face. I was wrong, she whispered. And I was too proud to admit it. I couldn't speak. Because suddenly I wasn't just standing in the house of a woman who wanted me to pretend to be her daughter's husband. I was standing inside my father's unfinished story. That dinner was supposed to be a lie. Instead, it became a confession. We sat at the table, but nobody touched the food. Evelyn brought out the letter. The paper was yellowed at the edges. She handed it to me. I recognized my father's handwriting immediately. My hands shook as I unfolded it. He had written that he didn't know whether his choices would ever make sense to me. He wrote that he hoped one day I would understand that a person's worth wasn't measured by what they managed to keep, but by what they were willing to give away when someone else needed it. Then came the sentence that broke me. He wrote, "If my son ever meets Nora, I hope he never tells her she owes our family anything. Love isn't a debt. If she ever needs a friend, I hope he becomes one." I couldn't see the rest because my eyes filled with tears. Nora reached across the table and took my hand. For the first time since my father died, I cried in front of someone. Not quietly. Not politely. I cried the way a 17-year-old boy should have cried years earlier but never allowed himself to. Nora moved beside me and held me. Evelyn cried too. And for several minutes, the three of us sat together, connected by a man who had been gone for 17 years. But there was another truth I had to face. I looked at Nora and told her that I couldn't pretend anymore. Not because I was angry. Because I was falling in love with her. She stared at me. "I asked you to pretend," she whispered. "I know. And now?" I squeezed her hand. "Now I don't want to pretend." She began to cry again, but this time she smiled through the tears. Evelyn watched us from across the table. "I knew she'd find you," she said again, only now her voice was gentle. Months passed. Nora and I didn't rush into marriage. We didn't turn one emotional afternoon into a fairy tale. Real life doesn't work that way. We learned each other slowly. We argued about stupid things. We discovered habits that annoyed us. We learned when to give each other space and when to reach for a hand. Nora visited my mother's grave with me. I visited her father's grave. And Evelyn became part of my life in a way neither of us expected. She apologized to my mother. That meeting was difficult. There were tears. There was anger. There were years of pain that couldn't disappear in one afternoon. But my mother eventually took Evelyn's hands and said, "Daniel would have hated knowing we were still carrying this." That was the moment the past finally loosened its grip. A year later, Nora and I were married. There was no extravagant wedding. We stood in a small garden beside the rehabilitation center where Nora had once learned how to walk again. Friends and family gathered around us. Evelyn sat in the front row. Before the ceremony, Nora handed me something. It was the old wedding ring she had placed in my palm that first afternoon. She had never intended for it to become real. But now it was. When I slipped it onto her finger, she whispered, "You were supposed to be my husband for one dinner." I smiled and answered, "I guess I needed more practice." She laughed through her tears. After the ceremony, Evelyn hugged me tightly. Then she whispered, "Your father would be proud." I looked across the garden at Nora. I think he already knew. Years later, I still think about that afternoon whenever life becomes difficult. I think about how easily we judge people when we don't know their entire story. I think about how pride can turn misunderstandings into years of pain. I think about how my father gave without expecting gratitude, how Evelyn carried guilt until she finally found the courage to apologize, and how Nora asked a friend to play the role of a husband because somewhere inside her, she already knew that friendship had become something deeper. Sometimes the person we think has entered our life by accident is actually connected to a story that began long before we met. Sometimes love doesn't arrive dramatically. Sometimes it walks through a bookstore, knocks over a pile of gardening books, and asks you to sit at a dinner table where the past is waiting. And sometimes the greatest second chance isn't getting back what you lost. It's finally understanding why you had to lose it. Speech balloon special request: before the story ends, tell us in the comments, what would you have done if you were in this situation? If this story touched your heart, please like, comment, share, and subscribe for more meaningful and inspiring stories. Your support encourages us to keep creating stories that touch hearts around the world. Because in the end, love isn't about pretending to be someone's husband, wife, friend, or family. Love is about choosing to stay when the truth becomes difficult, choosing forgiveness when anger feels easier, and choosing hope when the past has given you every reason to stop believing. Sometimes the most beautiful chapters of our lives begin with a lie we never meant to tell, and end when we finally become brave enough to tell the truth. If you want, I can continue story from this point, summarize key takeaways from the story, explain the story's main themes in plain language.